In the spring of 1986, an investigator parked his car in front of a small home in upstate New York where a deadly fire had broken out and killed his friend. The fire had long been extinguished, but the investigator was there now to try to figure out what had caused it. When the investigator entered the house, his eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe how extensive the damage was. When he made his way into the bedroom, where the fire had apparently started and where his friend had died, what he saw there sent a chill down his spine and confirmed that this was no ordinary fire. Kept his eyes locked on the road as he drove towards the home of his father, 58-year-old George Mott. It was 6 p.m. on March 26, 1986, and the sun was hanging low in the sky over Crown Point, which is a small country town in upstate New York. A few hours earlier, 32-year-old Kendall had received a phone call from his sister Kimberly. She had called their dad multiple times over the course of that day, but all she kept getting was his answering machine, so Kimberly was worried. Part of that worry came from the fact that their dad lived alone since he had divorced their mom a few years back. On top of that, his health was declining. George was an ex-smoker, and now he had some serious issues with his lungs. He used an oxygen mask, and he'd just recovered from a bout of pneumonia that had sent him to the hospital for a few days. Kimberly was afraid their dad might have fallen or passed out, or maybe even something worse. She knew it would be somewhat convenient for Kendall to stop by their dad's place on his way home from work, so she called him and begged him to go by and make sure their dad was okay. And of course, Kendall had said yes. But as Kendall drove through the woods down a lonely 2-lane road, he really wasn't too worried. He had visited with their dad at his house 2 days earlier. George was taking his medications and was in good spirits considering all the issues he'd been dealing with. Kendall was sure there was a reasonable explanation for why George wasn't answering his phone. Maybe George's friends picked him up and took him to a local diner called the Wagon Wheel, where Kendall knew they liked to hang out. If that was the case, then Kendall knew he wouldn't be gone for very long, and so Kendall planned to just wait inside the house until his dad came home, and then once he was back and he knew he was okay, Kendall would call Kimberly and everything would be fine. And regardless of if there was a problem or not with his dad, Kendall was happy to pop by because he was close with his dad. His dad used to be a firefighter, and he was very devoted to his profession. He spent long hours at the station away from the family, but since his retirement a few years ago, he was much more present in the lives of Kendall, Kimberly, and their children. And that really made Kendall happy. A few minutes later, Kendall pulled off the main road and began making his way down a long driveway that wound between tall maple trees. George lived in a tiny one-bedroom house in a sparsely populated area about 4 miles west of town. It was very peaceful and quiet and green out there. The nearest neighbor lived about a half-mile away. At the end of the driveway, Kendall parked his car a few feet away from his dad's house. He hopped out and then walked up to the front door. But as he got closer, he noticed that the windows near the front door looked a little bit different. They had a dark tint to them, kind of like the windows on a limousine. Kendall thought that was very strange, and he figured he would investigate once he got inside. And so Kendall got up to the front door and he knocked, but his dad didn't come to the door. And so Kendall reached down and tried the doorknob, and right away he felt two things. One, he felt the doorknob was already unlocked, and two, most importantly, he noticed the doorknob was hot to the touch. And immediately, a bolt of fear shot through Kendall, because a hot doorknob could mean there was a fire raging inside the house. And so Kendall immediately whipped open the door and looked inside, but there was no fire. In fact, the house was totally quiet and nearly pitch black. Kendall instinctively reached over and flipped the light switch, but the lights didn't turn on in the house. Even worse, there was this thick, dark haze hanging in the air that was impossible to see through. It smelled a little like smoke, but it also had this strange, sweet odor to it that made it much more unsettling. Everything Kendall was experiencing just felt totally dangerous. Whatever was going on here, Kendall knew it had to be bad, especially given the fact that his dad had lung issues. Breathing in whatever was in the air could not be good for him. So Kendall stepped into the front living room and yelled out for his dad, but there was no reply. Kendall felt his way through the furniture in the living room towards the back of the house to the bedroom where his dad slept, but when he got there, again, he just couldn't see anything. Kendall was really starting to panic now. He was desperate to get his hands on a flashlight, but he didn't have one, and he didn't have one in his car, and so Kendall turned, sprinted outside, got into his car, and sped over to the house next door to see if the neighbor had a flashlight. Luckily, the neighbor was home, and they did have a flashlight, and so after explaining what was going on, the two of them raced back over to George's house with this flashlight. But when Kendall arrived back at his dad's front door, he stopped. He was holding out hope that his dad was not home, and that he was safe, and that whatever was going on inside of his house had nothing to do with his dad. But Kendall also realized that now that they had this flashlight, when the neighbor went in there and shined it around, he might reveal something totally horrible to Kendall. And suddenly Kendall, standing there right in front of the door, he just felt like he couldn't handle that. He couldn't go in and see whatever happened to his dad. So Kendall stayed outside as the neighbor clicked on his flashlight, pulled the collar of his t-shirt up over his nose and mouth, and stepped into the house. The next few minutes were agonizing for Kendall as he waited to hear what was hidden beneath the black haze inside his father's home. Finally, the neighbor emerged from the house, and from the grim expression on the man's face, Kendall could tell something horrible had happened. Within the next hour, the house was filled with inspectors from the local police and fire departments, and all of them were deeply confused by the scene laid out before them. It didn't take them long to determine that a fire had broken out inside of George's house, but the way the fire behaved just didn't make sense. As the inspectors stepped through the front door and into the living room, they could see that there was a layer of black soot covering everything. But nothing in the room was actually burnt. It was clear that it had gotten very hot inside of that house. Sitting on a table in the middle of the room were 3 pill bottles that had all melted together into one plastic clump. There was also a nail hammered into the wall, and hanging from it was the metal handle of a fly swatter. But the flat plastic square that actually swats the flies, that part had melted off. Inspectors found other plastic objects in the living room that were warped or liquefied, but there was plenty of other stuff inside the house that should have melted, but for some reason didn't. There was a plastic model of an old sailing vessel that sat on the coffee table not far from the fly swatter and pill bottles, but it looked as good as new. There was also a stack of cassette tapes that sat next to the stereo that looked unaltered and ready to be played. The right side of the living room opened out into a small kitchen. George had decorated the sides of the refrigerator with colorful wallpaper, and that paper showed 0 signs of burning. But inside the refrigerator was a totally different story. The butter was completely melted, along with the plastic butter dish. In the meat drawer was an unopened package of hot dogs, and they were all cooked. The inspectors struggled to comprehend what actually happened. How could a refrigerator turn into an oven on the inside while the outside of it was totally unaffected by the heat? And things got even weirder as the inspectors moved to the back of the house to George's bedroom. As they stepped inside, inspectors could see the TV on George's wooden dresser was caved in on the top, where the plastic shell had melted down into itself. But the dresser it was sitting on was good as new, aside from the layer of soot that covered it. In the corner of the bedroom was George's oxygen machine. Not only was it undamaged by the heat, it was still running when the inspectors arrived. Resting on top of that machine was George's plastic oxygen mask. Unlike the television, the mask had not melted. This was made all the more strange because the mask and the machine were just inches from the bed, where clearly an intense fire had raged within the last day. Now the fire was out, leaving behind a scorched, tangled mess. The wooden bed frame was charred in places, but it was still standing up. The mattress, however, was totally destroyed. The stuffing was all burnt up, and the net of metal mattress springs were melted in a way that made them curve down into a V shape under the bed. You could actually see through those springs and underneath the bed, where a large hole had burned through the floorboards. But as the inspectors crouched down to take a closer look into that hole, they could see that something else had burned up in this strange fire. Tangled in the mattress springs was a man's foot, burned off near the ankle. Near the headboard was a charred fragment of a human skull. Beyond that, they found tiny piles of fine black ash in the wreckage of the bed, as well as in the crawlspace beneath the floorboards. Those ashes, along with the foot and the skull fragment, were all that remained of Kendall's father, George Mott. Before he died, George was a pretty big, sturdy guy, weighing in over 180 pounds. What was left of him now weighed about 3 pounds, easily fitting inside a shoebox. The confusion amongst the inspectors only continued to grow after finding George. George wasn't just burned, he essentially had been cremated. Cremation is the process where a dead body is burned to ashes, and it requires an immensely hot fire that burns inside of a special oven. Yet somehow, here George was, reduced to ash by this bizarre fire that only affected small portions of the house. It just didn't add up. If the temperature in the bedroom was hot enough to cremate George, how on earth was the house even still standing? But there was yet another mystery hanging over the scene. How did a fire as powerful as this one get ignited in the first place? The inspectors checked the electrical outlets, they checked the gas lines that ran in the crawlspace under George's bedroom, they completely dismantled the gas furnace that straddled the bedroom and the living room, and they could not find a single shred of physical evidence that might explain how George caught on fire. A few days later, the New York State police inspectors finally just gave up. They couldn't see any signs that foul play had occurred, so they filed a final report that simply stated that George's death was, quote, accidental. Then they closed the book on the case. But there was one inspector with the Essex County Fire Department who wasn't ready to give up so fast. That man's name was Tony Moret. Tony was 37 years old and had worked in the fire department since he was 16. He had known George Mott personally, they'd worked side by side as firemen, and Tony really liked George. So he was determined to find out what really happened to his friend. On top of all the weird anomalies they found at the scene of the fire, Tony was puzzled by one more thing. He knew George was obsessed with fire safety. Tony just couldn't believe that George would be careless enough to accidentally set himself on fire. But after hundreds of hours exploring every possibility for what could have happened to George, he was getting really frustrated. Tony knew a lot about the science of fire, but none of those scientific rules seemed to apply to what he was observing inside of George's house. Finally, one of Tony's colleagues gave him a tip about an organization down in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania that might be able to help. They were called Parascience International, and they specialized in the study of strange phenomena that couldn't be explained by traditional science. Tony was hesitant at first. When he thought of the paranormal, he thought of things like Bigfoot and UFOs and the Loch Ness Monster. To him, any organization that believed in those sorts of things was an organization he couldn't really take seriously. But he was desperate to find out what happened to George, and his own investigation had reached a dead end, and so he didn't really have anything to lose by considering a different perspective, even if it was totally unorthodox. So, in April of 1986, a few weeks after George's ashes were discovered, Tony took a deep breath, then picked up the phone and made the call to Parascience International. When Tony heard Larry's theory, he thought it sounded crazy, but he also thought it made more sense than any other explanation he'd heard for what happened to George. By the time Tony officially finished his own investigation into the death of George Mott, he concluded that the cause was spontaneous human combustion. But despite Tony's support of this theory, the official reports by police never changed for George Mott. His death is still listed as accidental, with no mention of spontaneous human combustion. While there are many believers in the theory, the vast majority of scientists dismiss spontaneous human combustion as pseudoscience that is unsupported by physical evidence. And the physical evidence in this case is still contradictory and confusing. But despite not fully understanding what happened, for instance, why the outside of George's refrigerator was untouched while the hot dogs inside were cooked through, Larry felt confident in his conclusion that George Mott was indeed a victim of spontaneous human combustion. According to the wishes of George's family, his ashes were sent to a crematorium, along with his foot and what was left of his skull. Then, after that second burning, George Mott was scattered at sea and finally laid to rest. One summer afternoon, a French farmer stood at his kitchen door, watching in fear as his dog ran in manic circles around his barnyard. The normally gentle animal had gone insane. Every time the farmer tried to grab him by the collar, the dog snapped at him and then went back to running in its crazy circles. But suddenly, the dog stopped running. He sniffed at the ground, then bit down on a rock and chewed on it so hard his mouth started to bleed. Nothing the farmer did could get him to stop. The dog just kept chewing on more and more rocks until blood was running down his mouth and his teeth were starting to fall out. What the farmer couldn't know as he watched his beloved dog go crazy was that only 2 days later, he, the farmer, would be the one running around that same yard, screaming incoherently like a madman. It was an inexplicable horror that would spread throughout the entire village, and no one would know how to stop it. That Friday afternoon, in August of 1951, Dr. Albert Gabay drove his car through the narrow streets of a village in the south of France. He had just spent a relaxing week with his family in the Pyrenees, which is a mountain range that runs along the border between France and Spain. His wife and 4 kids were still at their mountain cabin, enjoying their vacation, but Dr. Gabay had to reopen his office and return to work. Now, after a long drive, he was finally back in his hometown of Pont-Saint-Esprit. His route took him along a street that had been heavily bombed during World War II. He drove past gray stone buildings that stood next to piles of stone rubble. In the distance, he could see the Rhone River sparkling in the afternoon sun. He turned a corner and spotted his friend, the grocer, who stood in the doorway of his store greeting customers. Dr. Gabay waved hello through his car window and continued on his way. Further into town, he slowed to a stop so that the baker could carry sacks of flour across the street. Dr. Gabay loved this town, where he had lived his entire life. Pont-Saint-Esprit was small enough that there were only 2 other doctors besides him who worked there. It was a friendly place where everyone seemed to know each other. Not long ago, Dr. Gabay had wondered if he'd be forced to leave Pont-Saint-Esprit. During World War II, the village was occupied by the German army. Then Allied forces sent in warplanes to bomb the German troops. It was a terrifying ordeal, and the recovery had been slow, but the doctor was optimistic that the village would one day be fully restored to its former glory. The sun was low in the sky when Dr. Gabay turned into a small courtyard and parked his car. His home and medical office shared a stone building in the center of the village. As he carried his suitcase towards the front door, Dr. Gabay was looking forward to eating a simple dinner and getting to bed early. But when he opened the door, his housekeeper, who had arrived earlier to tidy up, rushed to greet him with a concerned look on her face. Before she could say anything, Dr. Gabay stopped in surprise. The waiting room of his first-floor office was jammed full of people. The small room had a dozen wood chairs pushed up against the walls, and every seat was filled. Old men leaned their heads back against the wall with their eyes closed. Some mothers held children in their laps, and other children were sprawled on the floor. Dr. Gabay recognized one entire family. Everyone looked clammy and pale. He took a breath and frowned. The room had a sharp and unpleasant odor. His housekeeper explained that over the last few hours, sick people kept showing up asking to see him. She told them that she wasn't sure what time he would return, but they decided to wait for him anyway. There was clearly something going around in the village, and Dr. Gabay wanted to be sure he wasn't dealing with a serious outbreak. Dinner would have to wait. Dr. Gabay headed for the exam room and told his housekeeper to send in the first patient. Over the next several hours, Dr. Gabay examined them one by one. Their complaints were identical: upset stomach, nausea, and chills. And so it seemed very likely that they all had mild cases of food poisoning. Dr. Gabay thought it was odd that so many people got hit with it at once, but he was sure there was a reasonable explanation for that. There had been a lot of problems with the food supply as France struggled to recover from the war, so it wasn't unusual for people to come down with food poisoning every once in a while. The treatment for it was simple. Most people just needed a few days' rest to make a full recovery. Dr. Gabay gave the patients some medicine to settle their stomachs and assured them that they would feel better soon. It would take several hours to get to every single patient, but when the last one had left his office, Dr. Gabai slowly made his way up the stairs to finally eat his dinner. He called his wife to explain what was going on, and after he was done reassuring her, he climbed right into bed and fell asleep. At 11 o'clock the next morning, Dr. Gabai was standing in the kitchen of a farmhouse with the family who lived there. Half of the family had been sick in his waiting room the evening before. Dr. Gabai didn't usually work on Saturdays, but he thought it would be good to check in on some of the patients he had seen. This was his second house call of the morning. He had looked over the family members one by one, and he was now examining a skinny boy dressed in a nightshirt. The boy said he felt better today, and Dr. Gabai smiled. He was glad that most of his patients seemed to be doing better. But something didn't feel quite right to Dr. Gabai. Even before he stopped in to see this boy and his family, he had started to wonder if something other than food poisoning was troubling the residents of Pont Saint-Esprit. For one thing, he had questioned all of the patients, but he still hadn't figured out what they had all eaten that could have made them all sick. But there was another thing Dr. Gabai noticed that was even stranger. The farmhouse's kitchen had an incredibly unpleasant odor. It was the same one that had filled his waiting room the day before. It took a while before the doctor could put his finger on where he had smelled it before. It was years ago, in his own house. Some mice had been living inside his bedroom wall, but then the mice died, and it took several days for the smell of decay to go away. That dead mouse odor, like a mixture of rotten cabbage and sulfur, was what he was smelling when he was around some of his patients. This farmhouse, like all of the houses he visited that morning, was clean. Its windows were open, and the smell of warm bread from the nearby bakery was coming in with the summer breeze. There was no evidence of mice anywhere. But for the moment, Dr. Gabai didn't have time to think about it too much. Just before noon, after finishing his house calls, the weary doctor returned to his office, and his waiting room was full again. All the patients were again showing signs of food poisoning, and all had that same horrible smell. Whatever had happened was clearly not an isolated event. Dr. Gabai had to get to the bottom of it before things got out of hand. At 11 o'clock that night, Dr. Gabai was still in his office doing paperwork when there was a knock on his door. He opened it to find one of the other doctors in the village standing there. His name was Dr. View, and he looked completely exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. Dr. View told him that he had also seen a lot of patients with symptoms of food poisoning while Dr. Gabai was away on vacation, and that the number of patients had begun to rise the day before Dr. Gabai came back to town. Dr. Gabai sighed and rubbed his temples. Unfortunately, the third doctor in the village was sick with the illness going around town and couldn't get out of bed. And so it was up to Dr. View and Dr. Gabai to handle whatever was happening. The two doctors could only handle so much. If more people got sick, they might not be able to take care of them all. The two doctors started to compare notes. Dr. View had also noticed that a lot of his patients were emitting the same awful odor of dead mice that Dr. Gabai had smelled, and Dr. View was just as mystified. On top of that, over the course of the day, both doctors had noted that some of their patients had symptoms that were so bizarre they didn't know how to start treating them. Their skin was growing pale, their pupils were dilated, and they struggled to keep their minds focused. It was so bad that several of them said they were no longer able to read. Whatever this disease was, it wasn't normal food poisoning. As the doctors wrapped up their meeting, they realized that between them, they had seen at least 230 patients in the last few days. In a town with a population of just 4,000, that was a huge number. They agreed that it was time to notify the authorities since the situation could stretch the town's resources. Before leaving, Dr. View stopped in the doorway and made a confession. He wasn't feeling well himself and wondered if he was coming down with the same illness as everyone else. As Dr. Gabai closed the door, he tried to stay calm and keep focused on the facts. He was relieved that he didn't feel sick, he just felt tired. But a medical crisis was clearly emerging in Pont Saint-Esprit, and now it looked like Dr. Gabai might be the only doctor healthy enough to handle it. With those heavy thoughts weighing on him, at 2 a.m, Dr. Gabai sat back down at his desk to catch up on his notes. Not long after, the phone rang. It was the wife of a local farmer named Felix Meissen. Dr. Gabai had made a visit to their home earlier on Saturday when he was making house calls. Felix's condition seemed to be improving, but now he could hear panic in the voice of Felix's wife. She said that Felix could hardly breathe or talk, and that he was acting like a madman. Within minutes, Dr. Gabai was in his car, speeding through dark country roads towards the farmhouse. Felix's wife met him at the door. She said that shortly after Dr. Gabai left their house on Saturday, Felix suddenly jumped up out of bed and ran out into the yard. Then he burst back in and rolled back and forth on his bed, screaming at the top of his lungs. Now, 12 hours later, he was curled up in a ball on the mattress, struggling to breathe. Dr. Gabai went immediately to the bedside to examine him. Felix was lying motionless, his breathing loud and ragged. He seemed barely conscious and didn't respond when Dr. Gabai spoke to him. His pupils were dilated and his temperature was low. Dr. Gabai worried that Felix's heart was going to give out if he didn't get treatment as soon as possible. The closest hospital that could handle this kind of emergency was an hour's drive south in a city called Nîmes. Dr. Gabai called for an ambulance and then tended to Felix while they waited for it to arrive. The doctor was grasping for any clue he could find, so he asked Felix's wife what they had eaten in the past few days. Just what they always ate, she said, summer stew, bread, cheese, and wine. But then she recalled that something terrible had happened at their house 2 days ago. They found their dog running in circles outside. Before they knew it, the dog was chewing on rocks until blood began pouring out of its mouth. Minutes later, their beloved pet went into convulsions and died. Dr. Gabai thought it was very possible that the dog's death was connected to the same illness that Felix and the others were all suffering from. If that was the case, the situation was even more serious than he thought. If the dog died, then people could die as well. The leaders of Pont Saint-Esprit needed to be alerted to the danger as soon as possible. That evening, Dr. Gabai sat in a crowded and stuffy room in the town hall where a heated discussion was underway. It was Sunday now, and earlier that day, he had convinced the mayor to call an emergency meeting about this strange medical crisis with the municipal council, the police chief, and other city officials. But so far, everyone was just arguing. Dr. Gabai was frustrated. There were now at least 280 people affected with this bizarre and now potentially lethal illness, and he was at his limit. Dr. Gabai had been working almost non-stop with very little sleep since he returned from his vacation over 48 hours ago. His eyes burned with fatigue and his temper rose, so he stood up and made sure his voice was strong, and he told everyone they needed to alert the town to the danger. The mayor placed a hand on his shoulder. He was just as concerned as Dr. Gabai, but scientists and medical experts from nearby universities had been summoned to study the problem, and the remains of Felix Meissen's dog would be sent to the lab to be analyzed. The mayor felt the best course was to gather that data and then figure out what to tell the townspeople. Anything else would make everyone more panicked. Dr. Gabai grew even more impatient. He insisted that their analysis would take too much time. The danger was already here, and people needed to be warned now so they could protect themselves. But the mayor held his ground. What would they warn people about exactly? They still didn't even know what was causing the trouble. At this point, the mayor thought the so-called crisis consisted of a dead dog and multiple people with a stomach flu, and there was no proof that the two were even related. But there was one precaution that the mayor did want to take right away. Before adjourning the meeting, the mayor turned to the police chief. Given the number of people afflicted with the illness, they couldn't rule out the possibility that someone was deliberately poisoning the village. The police chief agreed to launch a criminal investigation right away, but he would need assistance from law enforcement officials in neighboring cities. The meeting ended at 1 a.m., and Dr. Gabai started walking home, exhausted and frustrated. A criminal investigation seemed like a total waste of time to him. After all, why would anyone be launching such a vicious attack on their tiny and somewhat insignificant town? But then, the more he thought about it, the doctor supposed that a criminal motive could not really be ruled out. All he knew was that he needed to get home and sleep if he was going to be of any help to his patients the next day. But just as he entered the courtyard in front of his home, he heard high-pitched shrieks coming from the nearby grocery store. Dr. Gabay ran down the street to the store and pounded on the door. The grocer's wife was relieved to see him and brought him up the stairs to the family's apartment and into her daughter's room. There, on her bed, 5-year-old Marie Joseph Carl was writhing in agony. Her arms and legs were jerking, her fingers and toes clenched so tightly that they were white and bloodless. The doctor hurried to the child's side and tried to pry her toes open. In their rigid position, it was impossible for blood to flow properly, and her feet could be permanently damaged. Suddenly, Marie Joseph sat upright, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed at the air in front of her and screamed that tigers were coming to eat her. Dr. Gabay enlisted the mother's help to restrain the child, and then he gave Marie Joseph a shot of a sedative that he hoped would calm her down. The doctor rubbed his eyes and told the weeping mother that Marie Joseph had to be treated in a hospital and that he needed to call an ambulance. Dr. Gabay then walked down the hallway towards the kitchen where the phone was located, but as he stepped past the parents' bedroom, he stopped. There, inside the room, was the grocer, Mr. Carl, sitting up on his elbows in bed as he stared out the window. The doctor was confused as to why Mr. Carl wasn't tending to his daughter. The grocer seemed strangely preoccupied and disturbed. When Dr. Gabay stepped closer to him, he realized the grocer wasn't staring out the window, he was just staring at it. As if in a trance, Mr. Carl held up his finger and softly counted the 6 panes embedded in the window. He repeated the numbers over and over and over again. Dr. Gabay sniffed the air and detected that familiar smell of dead mice. It could only mean one thing, that Mr. Carl had fallen ill as well. After making sure Mr. Carl was comfortable, Dr. Gabay returned to Marie Joseph's bedroom. He expected her to be groggy from the sedative, maybe even asleep. Instead, he found the child alert and happy, as if she had been fully cured. The child looked at the doctor and smiled and told him that the tigers must have been a dream. The doctor checked her temperature and her pulse. She was totally back to normal. Instead of putting Marie Joseph to sleep, the sedative appeared to have completely cured her. Dr. Gabay shook his head. None of this made any sense. He decided to hold off calling the ambulance, thinking Marie Joseph could now fully recover at home. It was nearly dawn when Dr. Gabay said goodnight to the Carl family and staggered back to his house. As he opened his door, the phone was ringing. It was the hospital in Nîmes. Felix Meissen, the farmer, was dead. Whatever illness was attacking the town of Pont-Saint-Esprit, it was fatal. This had officially turned into a full-blown medical catastrophe. Later that morning, a wave of law enforcement officers swept into Pont-Saint-Esprit. They stopped people on the street to ask questions, they interrogated shopkeepers, and closed some shops entirely. The presence of so many police officers alarmed people, and gossip began to fly around the village. Every person knew someone who was sick. Some people speculated that perhaps the rumors were true, and a madman or killer was poisoning the village. Maybe he poisoned the water, or perhaps the salt or the meat or some other food. Some people quietly packed and left town. By the end of the day, the once bustling center of the village was growing empty and quiet. Dr. Gabay watched families leaving from the door of his house. He thought of his own wife and kids who were still on vacation in the mountains. He'd spoken to them briefly at the start of this sickness, but he wanted to check in on them again. So he placed a phone call to the vacation house. His wife was shocked when he updated her about the terrifying events unfolding in their town. She worried that her husband would wear himself out or get the awful illness himself. Dr. Gabay told his wife that he was fine, and he believed that she and their kids were safe since they were out of town. However, he had a duty to continue to treat the people of his village. Dr. Gabay hung up the phone. The next day was Tuesday, 4 days since he had come home from vacation. By mid-morning, the delegation of university doctors and scientists had arrived. They collected food scraps and sent them out to be analyzed by a scientific laboratory to test for poison. And then they ordered an autopsy to be performed on Felix Meissen. Dr. Gabay tried to reassure his patients that they'd have answers soon. But in private, he worried about how long it was taking. It would be several days at least before the test results came back and the autopsy was complete. He couldn't stand the thought of more people dying as they waited. Not only that, but Dr. Gabay didn't know how long he could continue to work without rest. and there was still the possibility that he would get sick himself. As the weeks wore on with still no news about the tests or the autopsy, Dr. Gabay saw dozens of patients in his office and crisscrossed the streets to visit the sicker patients at home. His phone rang every night with news of more strange symptoms emerging. Now, many of his patients seemed irrationally happy. They talked so quickly that it was impossible to understand them. But then, just as fast as the euphoria emerged, it would come crashing down, leaving the patients overcome with anguish. And then there were the patients who just couldn't sleep. Instead, they would gather in the street in the middle of the night. Dr. Gabay could hear them from his window, chatting and laughing with a strange, frenetic energy. Others he could see wandering aimlessly through the dark streets, silent and lost. It was as if Pont Saint-Esprit had become haunted and cursed. The village priest prayed to saints to lift the curse from the town. Dr. Gabay wasn't superstitious, but it made him remember a disease he had read about many years before. It was called St. Anthony's Fire, a sickness that happened back in the Middle Ages and caused entire villages to go mad, just like he was seeing in Pont Saint-Esprit. Back then, many people believed that it was a curse from the devil. Dr. Gabay was a man of science, but he wondered if there could be a connection. At this point, a supernatural explanation from the 15th century was as good as any other. Dr. Gabay shook his head. This was modern France, and medicine didn't operate on hunches. The most pressing thing right now was for the toxicology lab to finish its work. In the meantime, he would continue to treat his patients as well as he could, and he would look up old diseases once he had some free time. He hoped this would be soon. Once the lab had an answer, he would know how to treat the disease, everyone would get better, and he would have enough time to pursue his hunches. Instead, he'd find out things could still get much, much worse. It was Friday evening, just 1 week since Dr. Gabay had returned from his vacation. He was in his car following an ambulance that carried little Marie Joseph Carl. Her delirious visions of tigers had returned, and she had become so violent that her mother had to tie her to the bed. Dr. Gabay had watched helplessly as the 5-year-old was loaded into an ambulance, kicking and screaming. As he parked his car in front of the old hospital in Pont Saint-Esprit, he noticed that every light in the building was blazing. As he walked to the entrance, Dr. Gabay saw a man appear in a second-floor window, waving his arms wildly. And then, to Dr. Gabay's horror, the man climbed out the window and stood on the ledge. 2 nurses quickly crept up behind him, begging him to get back in the room, but every time they reached out, the man smacked their hands away. Then the man stretched out his arms and proclaimed that he was an airplane and that he could fly, and then he jumped. He landed with his feet on the pavement, and immediately there was this deafening crack as both of his legs snapped in half. The man screamed in agony as he lay on his back. But suddenly, the man's energy shifted. It was as if he pushed the pain right out of his body and replaced it with intense anger. Somehow, the man with the 2 broken legs rose up and then took off running full speed down the boulevard. Dr. Gabay couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could anyone run on 2 totally broken legs? And this was only the beginning of the night that seemed to Dr. Gabay like an apocalypse. He entered the hospital to find the wards packed full of screaming, struggling patients. His patients who had seemed to be getting better were now totally psychotic. Many screamed that their hands and feet were on fire. Some fought desperately against imaginary enemies in the air. The odor of dead mice was now overwhelming. Dr. Gabay was on the brink of collapse. He started to wonder if he himself had gotten sick. Was he hallucinating or going crazy? Dr. Gabay considered whether he should just give up and finally get the sleep he so desperately needed. But ultimately, he knew that quitting was a violation of his oath as a doctor, and the residents of Pont Saint-Esprit were counting on him, so he chose to soldier on. He put out an order that Marie Joseph be sent to another hospital 30 miles away in Avignon, where he hoped it would be calmer. Then he tried injecting some of the victims with sedatives, hoping to quiet them since it had worked before with Marie Joseph. But the sedatives had absolutely no effect on their ferocious behavior. The strength and violence of the patients was beyond belief. They were dangerous to themselves and to everyone around them. One patient sprung up from his bed, punching and kicking at everyone around him. It took 14 men to hold him down. While that was happening, several other patients broke away from their rooms and tried to jump out windows or run through walls. Dr. Gabay saw no option but to immobilize patients in straitjackets and send them to be locked up in a psychiatric hospital. But then the hospital ran out of straitjackets. Nurses tied patients to their beds with ropes and twine, where they lay screaming in horror. When they ran out of rope, the nurses used horses' reins. But the restraints didn't hold. One by one, victims broke away and ran back out into the hospital garden, where they uprooted tomato stakes and wielded them like swords against each other. Dr. Gabay worked through the night trying to treat the injuries that patients had inflicted on themselves. One of these patients was the man who had leapt out of the window and broken both of his legs. It took 8 men to hold him down as Dr. Gabay set his fractures. As he worked, Dr. Gabay noticed that the man's toes were rigid and bluish green. Over the course of this long and horrible night, it seemed like every patient he had seen had toes and fingers that were stiff and lifeless. Dr. Gabay paused as the screaming and mayhem continued all around him. He thought of Marie Joseph's rigid hands and feet. He thought of the terrible smell that reminded him of dead mice. He thought again of the Middle Ages and the curse of St. Anthony's fire. And then a picture started to come into focus in his mind. He would need the lab results to prove it, but he believed he had just figured out what was causing this horrific sickness, and it tied all the way back to the medieval plague of St. Anthony's fire. It took several days for Dr. Gabay and the medical investigators to fully uncover the truth, but they discovered that it had all started in an unassuming shop in the center of Pont Saint-Esprit. At noon on Thursday, August 16th, the day before Dr. Gabay returned from vacation, the village baker, Roche-Brion, completed the third and last batch of bread of the day. Roche had been a baker in Pont Saint-Esprit for 30 years. Every household in the village bought at least one fresh loaf of bread every day, and many thought that Roche's bread was the best in town. However, on that day, August 16th, Roche was not pleased with the quality of his product. As he kneaded the dough, he noticed that the color was slightly gray. There had been complaints about the bread recently. He blamed the flour, which had been delivered to him by the government agency that supplied flour to bakeries all over France. Ever since the war, the flour had been of bad quality. It was usually wheat flour mixed with flour made from rye grain and dried beans. Sometimes it even contained dust and insects. That day he was making the bread, the baker knew that the dough just seemed a little off. Still, every time he tasted it, he thought it tasted fine. So he baked the bread, put it out for sale, and decided he'd lodge a protest with the flour suppliers the next morning. All day Thursday, people streamed into his shop for their bread, and again all day Friday and Saturday. Before dawn on Sunday, Roche and his wife were feeling a little nauseous, but they decided to take an overnight trip to see their kids who were spending the summer out of town. When Roche and his wife returned to Pont Saint-Esprit on Monday, the epidemic was in full swing. His bakery had been closed by the police, and Roche's wife was now so ill that she went straight to bed. When the police concluded their investigations, they confirmed that everyone who got sick had bought bread from Roche's bakery. What Roche didn't know was that a portion of the rye grain that was used by the government to dilute the flour was bad. It had gotten damp in the field and a fungus had grown on it. That fungus had been ground up with the rest of the grain as it was turned into flour, and this flour ended up in a sack that was delivered to Roche's bakery to use for making his bread. This fungus was incredibly resilient. It not only survived being ground into flour, it also survived the high heat of Roche's bakery oven. It lay dormant in the crusty brown loaves Roche sold to his customers, and then when Roche's customers ate their bread, this fungus entered their bodies. The fungus caused their stomachs to cramp, made it impossible to sleep, and caused people to feel like their hands and feet were burning. It also triggered hallucinations of tigers and airplanes and flying. It even made dogs turn on their owners and think that rocks were food. In fact, it had affected all sorts of animals, including pigs, ducks, and cats. All of these bizarre responses were triggered by chemicals in the fungus. One of these chemicals was lysergic acid, from which lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, is made. LSD is a very powerful hallucinogen. On top of all of this, when people ate the fungus, it set off a response in their bodies that cut off circulation to their limbs. The terrible stink that reminded Dr. Gabai of dead mice was actually the smell of his patient's fingers and toes slowly rotting with gangrene. This gangrene was well known in the Middle Ages when it was a symptom of the plague known as St. Anthony's Fire. Now, hundreds of years later, in 1951, this same plague was running rampant through the village of Pont Saint-Esprit long after the disease had passed out of memory. The fungus was known as ergot, and the illness it caused was known to modern medicine as ergotism. Ultimately, 7 people died and nearly 300 people were sickened in the ergotism outbreak in Pont Saint-Esprit. It took several months for the disease to run its course. Most patients slowly got better and were able to resume their normal lives. The baker, Roche, was at first suspected of intentionally poisoning the village, but was later found to be blameless. The memory of the 1951 poisoning still haunts the village. The official investigations went on for years. Finally, it was agreed that the people of Pont Saint-Esprit had indeed been under the influence of some kind of hallucinatory substance contained in the flour. How the substance got into the flour remains under debate to this day. In 1987, a woman walked into a public health center in Goiânia, Brazil, desperate for help. She was pale and weak, and she said a strange sickness was slowly killing her family. The official who saw the woman thought she was exaggerating, but just 24 hours later, he realized she was the key to solving one of the worst disasters in Brazil's history. On the hot evening of September 20th, 1987, 37-year-old Maria Ferreira hosted a lively family gathering at her small home in Goiânia, Brazil. Goiânia was a cosmopolitan city with nearly 1 million people. Gleaming skyscrapers and tropical fruit trees lined the wealthy downtown area. But there were also areas of extreme poverty. Maria and her husband, Davayer, lived in one of these lower-income neighborhoods where they owned and operated a scrapyard on their property. It was hard work, especially in the intense tropical heat. But Maria and Davayer made a great team. Maria liked to joke that even though Davayer was short and stocky, he always had his head in the clouds. Davayer would tease Maria when she took things too seriously, saying that that was why she had a gray streak in her long brown hair. But on this night, Maria was totally relaxed. There was plenty of delicious food and drink with people she loved, and they were able to pay for it because they had a little extra money from selling more scrap metal than usual. Maria and Davayer had also acquired a rare good luck charm a few days earlier. They never had much in the way of material possessions, but they tried to find beauty in their everyday life. This time, it was in a trinket Davayer had found. As they passed it around the table, she felt grateful for all the good fortune that had come their way. In the chair next to Maria, Davayer scooped a spoonful of black bean and pork stew onto his plate. He was listening to his brother, who was a bus driver, tell a story. He always had something funny to share from one of his routes. Davayer's other brother, Ivo, was there as well with his wife and their 6-year-old daughter, Lei Ji. The little girl's big brown eyes and joyful laugh filled Maria with love. Lei Ji was the closest thing she had had to a daughter since she didn't have any children of her own. It was the perfect night, and that called for a toast. Once everyone refilled their glasses, Maria raised hers in the air and thanked her family for coming. They all cheered and drank to the future. Later, after everyone left, Davayer went into the garage to finish up some work. As Maria washed coffee cups and put away plates, she could hear thunder in the distance. The next morning, on September 21st, Maria woke to the sound of rain pelting her tin rooftop. Goiânia's rainy season normally ran from October to April, but this year it had started earlier than usual. As Maria climbed out of bed, she noticed that she didn't feel well. Her body was stiff and her stomach felt upset. She wrote off her discomfort to the previous night's festivities and tried to carry on with her day. But as time passed, Maria was starting to feel increasingly sick until finally, After a few hours, she started violently vomiting. Now, the pain in Maria's stomach was so bad that she decided she needed to see a doctor right away. She slowly got dressed and walked out to tell Debayer. Maria found him working in the scrapyard. It was cluttered with old refrigerators, large pieces of sheet metal, and disassembled machines. Debayer offered to take her, but she said she didn't want to distract him from his work, so she told him she could get there on her own. Maria took a bus to a nearby hospital and was able to see a doctor right away. After the doctor examined her, he said everything was fine. She must be having an allergic reaction to something she ate. Maria was relieved it wasn't something more serious. She found it hard to believe she could be this sick from food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and once she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs, but whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Debayer's house, and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Leiji, to come join them. But Leiji was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Leiji did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Leiji threw up. Then, later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now, that included Debayer, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother, who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of Debayer's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and Debayer. 2 of Debayer's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger. And so, on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was, she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. Debayer wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus, and about a half hour later, they got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria dropped the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking, and she noticed his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that right now she just needed to see a doctor, but he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis, but she didn't know what else to do, so she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease, and her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she'd developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus. Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her, and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly. This could be a dangerous situation. The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face the more they talked. Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her, and then she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick. The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Goiânia, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger. Devayer told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning, around 10 a.m., a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Devayer said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption. There was also a small capsule shaped like an oversized thermos. Devayer thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Devayer examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Devayer paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage. He left them there before heading inside to eat dinner. Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Devayer opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule. Devayer was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage so she could see it too. When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Devayer. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to Devayer. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but Devayer was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family. Devayer was determined to continue examining this object. So he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powder. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all Devayer knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they'd never imagined. As Devayer told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, Devayer shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors, and each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. Small groups of people gathered around the capsule and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside. Many touched the small pellets Devayer had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made Devayer determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of Devayer's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, Devayer gave the capsule to two of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets. Devayer gave a grain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of Devayer's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection. Maria's mother handled some of the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she too became ill. Around that same time, Devayer had given some fragments to his brother Ivo, and later, Ivo's daughter, Leiji, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. Devayer also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder. So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told Devayer she was taking what was left of the powder and the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag, then she headed out with one of Devayer's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrapyards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked Devayer about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it. Devayer said he wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby. Dr. Ferreira turned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white, because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic. The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137. When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments, but without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that Devayer found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger. Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the public health agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high they were literally off the charts. But the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Goiânia's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devayer bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic, where the blue powder was first discovered, was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Leiji, also died on the same day. They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, Devayer's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they had received when they melted down the capsule for Devayer. While Maria's husband, Devayer, survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. Devayer died in 1994, 7 years later. Thankfully, no one else died from the radiation exposure, but many others sustained amputations, severe burn scars, and lifelong medical conditions. The Goiânia incident remains one of history's deadliest disasters involving medical radiation. In June of 1999, a surgeon in Mumbai, India, stood in his operating room feeling totally shocked. The patient lying on the operating table in front of him had a condition that was so horrifying the surgeon could barely process what he was looking at. But after a moment of stunned silence, the surgeon shook his head and refocused. He needed to act quickly if this patient was going to have any chance at survival. So the surgeon took a deep breath and then reached his hand into the incision he'd already made in the patient's stomach. He He felt around inside for a moment, and eventually his hand came in contact with something that should not have been there. It was large and solid and felt totally alien. And the surgeon just grabbed it as hard as he could and began to pull. On a humid summer morning in June 1999, 36-year-old Sanju Bhagat was hard at work on a farm outside of Nagpur, a city in central India. The sun had just risen, and the air was already so hot that he found it hard to breathe. Sanju and a group of farmhands were hard at work tending to the soybean crops. He made his way through the field, stopping to catch his breath every few steps. Sanju moved a lot slower than his coworkers because of his massive belly. For the past 15 years, Sanju had struggled beneath the weight of his ever-growing stomach. At first, when he was in his early 20s, his family had thought he was just filling out a little, like all young men do when they become adults. But Sanju's stomach didn't stop growing. It kept getting bigger and bigger until it had swelled to the size of a massive watermelon. But his arms and legs stayed stick-thin. He never understood why his belly kept growing since he didn't eat much. By the time Sanju reached his early 30s, he was in constant pain, and his family desperately wanted him to see a doctor. But he couldn't afford to take time off of work. Although, deep down, he had to admit he was a little scared of what the doctor might find. Sanju wiped the sweat from his eyes and told himself to keep moving. As he shoveled, he overheard another farmhand make a nasty joke about maternity clothes. A few men laughed. People liked to joke that he looked pregnant. Sanju had been relentlessly teased about his so-called pregnancy for years. His neighbors and his old childhood friends would point and laugh at him. He knew he should be used to it by now, but it still upset him. But his belly wasn't just a source of embarrassment for Sanju. The sheer weight of his stomach made even the simplest things, like getting up from a chair or bending over, very hard to do. Even now, as he pushed himself to keep up with the other men in the field, he could feel his back stiffening and his arms and shoulders aching. By midday, he felt ready to drop from physical exhaustion. The sun beat down on Sanju's head and he could feel his chest tighten. He tried to keep working, but today it was harder to breathe than usual. No matter how deeply he inhaled, he couldn't quite catch his breath. Finally, he dropped his shovel and doubled over, gasping for air. Sanju gathered what little strength he had left and stood up straight. He could feel other farm workers' eyes on him as he gathered his tools and headed home. It was the longest walk of Sanju's life. He felt humiliated and useless, but he was also afraid. He could barely take a breath. By the time he got to the small home he shared with his family, he nearly fell through the front door. The last thing he remembered was falling hard on the tile floor. Sanju's mother was fixing lunch in the kitchen when she heard a noise in the front of the house. She ran into the living room and found her son collapsed on the floor. She grabbed the phone and called an ambulance, then rushed to Sanju's side and knelt down beside him. She tried to roll him over on his back so he could breathe better, but it was very difficult because of his enormous stomach. She muttered every prayer she could think of, straining her ears for the sound of a siren. And finally, in the distance, she heard it. By the time the ambulance pulled up in front of their home, Sanju was barely breathing. The paramedics quickly assessed Sanju's condition. They put an oxygen mask on him, then strapped him to a gurney and loaded him up into an ambulance. Sanju's mother wanted to go with him, but the nearest major hospital was in Mumbai, an 11-hour drive from Nagpur. All she could do was watch as the ambulance sped away with her son. Early the next morning, Dr. Ajay Mehta had just started his shift in the oncology ward at Tata Memorial Hospital. He was alerted that a new patient named Sanju Bhagat had been brought in all the way from Nagpur and that he needed to be seen right away. Dr. Mehta hurried over to Sanju's room. If someone was rushed in an ambulance from so far away, it had to be a serious emergency. As soon as Dr. Mehta examined Sanju's giant swollen belly, he instructed the nurse to prepare the operating room for surgery. Dr. Mehta was a specialist in tumor removal, and he was certain that Sanju had a massive tumor in his stomach, possibly the biggest one he'd ever seen. The tumor was likely pressing against Sanju's diaphragm, which was why he couldn't breathe. And given how big it was, and Sanju's weakened condition, the tumor had to be removed immediately. While another nurse prepped Sanju for the operation, Dr. Mehta gathered his surgical team and headed to the operating room. As they sterilized their hands and put on clean scrubs, Dr. Mehta warned them that the tumor's sheer size would make this a very challenging operation. There was a risk of damaging the soft tissue in Sanju's stomach, his nerve endings, or blood vessels. In the worst case, the surgery could cause severe internal bleeding or even death. A few minutes later, Sanju was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. Once he was under anesthesia, Dr. Mehta called for a scalpel. He placed one hand on Sanju's stomach for leverage, then he cut into Sanju's belly. After the blade broke through Sanju's skin and opened up his chest area, Dr. Mehta expected to see blood and a bright red mass of cancerous cells. Instead, gallons of thick, yellowish fluid gushed from Sanju's stomach, spilling onto the floor. The entire surgical team gasped. Dr. Mehta jumped out of the way, trying to avoid the surge of bile. It had a foul odor that made everyone in the room start to gag. Nurses ran toward him with towels, trying to sop up the putrid-smelling liquid. While they cleaned up the mess, Dr. Mehta remained calm and carefully inserted his hand into Sanju's stomach to locate the tumor. At first, all he felt was thick jelly-like fluid sliding between his fingers. Then he grazed something unusual. His eyes went wide as he dove a little deeper. His palm wrapped around something soft, but with a brittle core. He realized this was not a tumor. Whatever was in Sanju's stomach had bones, a lot of them. Dr. Mehta's jaw dropped as his hand explored the object floating in Sanju's stomach. He grabbed onto one of the tiny bones and began to slowly pull it up and out of Sanju's stomach. As he lifted the bizarre object into the air, he could hear more gasps from everyone in the room. Dr. Mehta could hardly believe his eyes. What he was looking at shouldn't be possible. He had never seen anything like this in his entire medical career. He placed it on a medical tray for analysis and turned back to Sanju. Thankfully, he had survived the operation, but Dr. Mehta couldn't help but speculate how something so strange could have gotten inside of Sanju. A few hours later, Sanju awoke in a hospital bed. His stomach was sore, but when he moved his hand to grasp his belly, he looked down in shock. The giant lump was gone. He ran his hand over his flat stomach. He hadn't seen it like this in almost 20 years. He took a deep breath and smiled as he felt his chest expand. He couldn't believe he could breathe again without any pain. Just then, Dr. Mehta appeared in the doorway to Sanju's room with a very serious look on his face. He confirmed that the surgery was a success, but as Dr. Mehta explained what they had found inside of his body, the smile slowly faded from Sanju's face. The object Dr. Mehta had removed from Sanju's stomach was a ball of pink flesh with a tuft of dark brown hair growing along one side. 2 fully formed feet protruded from either end. In the middle was the beginning of a jawline. But what Dr. Mehta couldn't forget was the fully formed human hand that was attached to this ball of flesh. It was what he had grasped in a gruesome handshake when he lowered his hand into Sanju's stomach. The hand had fingernails protruding from it. The nails were so overgrown they almost looked like tiny claws. A grayish-yellow tube grew out of the center of the fleshy mass, connecting it to Sanju's stomach. Dr. Mehta told Sanju that the surgical staff had witnessed one of the rarest medical conditions on Earth. In a way, Sanju had been pregnant, not for the 16 years that his belly was protruding, but since before he was even born. the hairy, mutated lump he had removed was Sanju's twin. Sanju was a victim of an incredibly rare condition called fetus in fetu, which means fetus in fetus. When Sanju and his twin were first conceived, they started out as identical twins, which is when a single fertilized egg splits into two embryos. But something went wrong during that division, and the cells that became Sanju's twin latched onto his embryo. As Sanju developed, his body formed around the twin's cells, which in turn fed off his bloodstream. This twin did not have a functional brain or heart, so it wasn't alive in the traditional sense. But as Sanju grew, so did his twin. It fed on the contents of Sanju's stomach like a parasite, using the yellowish tube as an umbilical cord. If Dr. Maeda hadn't eventually removed it from Sanju's stomach, it would have gotten so big that it would have killed Sanju. Sanju recovered physically from the surgery in just a few weeks. But when he returned to Nagpur, he was upset to find that his neighbors still made fun of him. Word had spread in the news about what had been inside of his stomach. Instead of calling him pregnant, now he was the man who gave birth to his brother. After his surgery, Sanju refused to allow doctors to follow up with his case. He never wanted a reminder that he had carried a dead twin inside of his belly. The next and final story is called One by One. In the spring of 1862, a man in London, England, named Richard Turner, sat on his son's bed. He held the sick little boy in his arms and spooned some medicine into his mouth. The child swallowed it and then let out a painful cough. Richard's wife, Elizabeth, who was standing by his side, looked at her husband with alarm. It had been a horrific few months for Richard and his family. 2 of their 4 kids had become ill and died of a deadly disease called diphtheria. As their son coughed again, both parents knew he had contracted the disease as well. In the 19th century, diphtheria was a plague across England and Europe. It caused dead tissue to build up in the back of the victim's throat. Eventually, this dead tissue would harden into a thick gray membrane, and it would become impossible for the victim to swallow or breathe. Diphtheria spread rapidly and affected children more than adults. Often, entire city blocks full of kids became sick at the same time. It was highly contagious, painful, and almost always fatal. Worst of all, there was no cure. All the doctors could do was administer a variety of tonics and hope they would reduce the symptoms enough for the patient's body to fight off the disease on its own. The Turners had brought in doctors to try and save their children, but nothing the physicians tried had worked. Now all Richard and Elizabeth could do was watch helplessly as their 3rd child got paler and weaker from the lack of oxygen. The little boy became delirious and drifted in and out of consciousness. Just 1 week after he got sick, he died in his parents' arms. At the start of the year, they had 4 healthy children. Now they only had 1 child left, a 3-year-old girl named Anne Amelia. The Turners were completely devastated. But they were also perplexed. The rest of their neighborhood seemed untouched by this disease, while only their family was affected. The morning after their son's death, Richard went to work in a haze of grief. Over the next few weeks, they barely slept at night because they were listening for any sign of Anne Amelia getting sick too. Then, late one night, while Richard and Elizabeth were laying in bed, they heard a sound from Anne Amelia's bedroom, a tiny cough and then another. Richard's heart filled with dread. Diphtheria had come for their last child. By breakfast, Anne Amelia was visibly weak. She struggled to swallow her biscuit, and even sipping warm milk was painful. Richard and his wife couldn't just sit by and watch their last child die. There had to be someone in the medical field who could help Anne Amelia. Their neighbor told them about a doctor they'd heard of who was considered one of the best in London. His name was Thomas Orton, If anyone could help their child get better, it was him. The next morning, Richard made his way to the hospital where Dr. Orton practiced. He managed to meet with him and begged the doctor for his help. Initially, Dr. Orton was resistant to the idea. He was extremely busy, and since there was no cure for diphtheria, he was skeptical that he'd actually be able to help them. But Richard would not give up. He pleaded with the doctor to please help what was left of his family. Their daughter's life was at stake. Dr. Orton was moved. He nodded as he shook Richard's hand, and he agreed to help them. The next morning, on April 3rd, 1862, Dr. Orton packed his medical bag and left for the Turner home. The family lived in the Limehouse district, which was one of London's poorest neighborhoods. He wasn't shocked that sickness was prevalent there. The 1800s were a dark time for the entire city. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a crowded, polluted mess. No matter where you went, it was difficult to escape the stink of raw sewage. Factories spewed toxic black smoke which permanently lingered in the air as a thick haze. Dr. Orton's carriage sped through the dense crowds, past beggars holding out hands for money, many of whom were children. Across the River Thames, trash and dead fish lined the banks. In the Limehouse neighborhood, conditions were even worse. Dr. Orton placed a handkerchief over his nose and mouth to minimize the foul smell of animal waste and rotten food that seemed to be everywhere. When the carriage finally arrived at the Turners' home, Dr. Orton stepped down onto the narrow sidewalk, then he walked to their door, braced himself, and knocked. Richard Turner opened it, looking exhausted and ashen-faced, but he lit up at the sight of this doctor and welcomed him inside. Once Dr. Orton entered the tiny front parlor, he was pleasantly surprised. The home was like an oasis in this hellish neighborhood. It was clean, warm, and well-kept. The Turners brought him into the children's room. A few toys were scattered about on the floor. Colorful drawings hung on bright green wallpaper, and fresh plants were perched on the dresser. Little Anne Amelia sat slumped on the bed against a pillow, covered in heavy blankets. She barely stirred when they entered. Her head hung to the side and her eyes were glassy. Dr. Orton could hear her struggling to breathe. The doctor opened his leather bag and got to work examining the child. He pulled out a tongue depressor and asked Anne Amelia to open her mouth as wide as she could. When he looked inside to the back of her throat, he was surprised. He couldn't see any signs of a thick gray membrane normally caused by diphtheria. This was unusual, but it also meant that the disease clearly had not progressed as far as he had feared. With treatment, maybe he had time to suppress her symptoms and give her body time to heal itself. He spoon-fed her some opium tincture to ease her discomfort and showed Mrs. Turner how to rub ointment made from coal tar on her daughter's chest. Then he shared his findings with Richard and his wife. He hoped he had gotten to Anne Amelia's symptoms in time before the diphtheria overwhelmed her. Dr. Orton could see relief wash over the parents' faces. Now all they could do was wait. Over the next 2 weeks, Anne Amelia did not improve. Even though Dr. Orton checked in on her and her parents tended to her night and day, she still became even weaker. And just before the end of April, the 3-year-old died. The Turners were destroyed. Their entire family had been wiped out in less than 2 months. Dr. Orton's heart broke for them. He felt frustrated and angry. He couldn't get little Anne Amelia's case out of his head. Something just didn't seem right. The day after Anne Amelia's death, Dr. Orton sat in his office, poring through his notes. He struggled to make sense of what had happened. Every other doctor the Turners had hired had diagnosed the children with diphtheria, and all signs did point to that being the disease they all had. Except Anne Amelia's throat had never developed the thick membrane that normally came with diphtheria. Dr. Orton couldn't shake the feeling that something else had killed her and potentially had killed her siblings. It was a crazy thought, but if it was true, that could explain why no one else in their neighborhood had caught the highly contagious disease. Perhaps what killed the Turner children wasn't contagious after all. Dr. Orton was anxious to get more information from the Turners. So, just after Aunt Amelia's passing, the doctor returned to their house. Despite their overwhelming grief, the two parents welcomed Dr. Orton inside, and they sat together at the kitchen table. He asked them if anything had changed recently at home. He was curious whether they had eaten any new foods or maybe met new people in the area, but the parents said no, nothing has changed. Then the doctor asked if he could check their water source. At that time, families in the Limehouse district retrieved their water from pumps located on the street. People would have to queue up with buckets or tubs and haul whatever they could back home. The doctor inspected the water, and while it was far from clean, he couldn't imagine that it was the cause of their tragedy. And if it was, he didn't understand why other families weren't afflicted as well. Dr. Orton asked the Turners to think of anything else that might have changed in the last several months, anything. Mr. Turner paused and said the only thing he could think of had happened around Christmas. They had saved enough money to buy the kids some new blankets and toys. They had even redecorated their room. The holiday season had been festive and happy, and their good cheer continued into the new year. But then, in February, everything changed. That was when their oldest child fell sick. It happened so fast, and it seemed to come from nowhere. Since then, their lives had been a nightmare. Dr. Orton listened quietly, frustrated that he couldn't glean any clues from what the Turners were sharing. He thanked them as he got up from the table, and then asked if he might take one more look inside the children's room. Richard and his wife nodded. As he walked through the empty room, everything looked the same. The toys were still on the floor, the bed had the same blankets neatly pulled back. Then the doctor's eyes flickered past the pictures on one side of the wall, and that's when he saw something that he had not noticed before. A few hours later, Dr. Orton was sitting at a table in a dimly lit pub just around the corner from his office. Across the table from him was Dr. Henry Letheby, who was a professor of chemistry and taught at the most prestigious hospital in the country, the London Hospital. As they sipped whiskey, Dr. Orton told him about the diphtheria diagnosis of the Turner children. He described how none of the treatments had improved Aunt Amelia's symptoms. Then he described how her throat had never been scarred by the leathery membrane that was so common in diphtheria. Dr. Letheby agreed that a number of things seemed suspicious, but if it wasn't diphtheria, he had no idea what else could have happened. That's when Dr. Orton shared what he had seen in the children's bedroom and why he thought it could explain the tragedy that had fallen on the Turners. Dr. Letheby thought it was a long shot, but he was intrigued by Orton's theory, and he agreed to help him test it. Aunt Amelia had not been buried yet, so the next day, Dr. Orton ordered a tissue sample to be taken from her body. Then he sent that sample to Dr. Letheby for analysis. In the meantime, he ran some tests of his own on the unusual thing that he had discovered in the children's bedroom. A few days later, Dr. Letheby and Dr. Orton compared notes. They now understood the cause for the rapid and tragic deaths of the 4 Turner children, and it was not diphtheria. It all started just before Christmas. Richard and his wife wanted to make the children's room as festive as possible to celebrate the holiday season. So one Saturday, they decided to shop for new wallpaper and selected a pattern that the whole family loved. It was intricate and beautiful, and best of all, it was a stunningly bright green. The color was actually called Shayla's green, named after the designer. The shopkeeper told them it was a top seller at their store. When Richard put the paper up on the walls, the room was transformed. The 4 children were overjoyed. In fact, they were so mesmerized by the vivid green wallpaper, they tore off little pieces to play with. Sometimes they would lick it like candy. But what neither the children nor the parents realized was that there was actually a special ingredient in the dye. This ingredient helped to create that very bright green that they all loved so much, and this special ingredient made its way into the children's bodies and traveled through their bloodstreams. It saturated their lungs and caused fluid and mucus to build until one by one, it killed each child. That special ingredient was a deadly poison called arsenic. When Dr. Orton had returned to the children's room days before, he noticed that pieces of the wallpaper were missing. After questioning the Turners about the reason, and them saying their kids were ripping them off and licking them, and then after running tests on Aunt Amelia's stomach and then the wallpaper itself, the mystery was solved. At that time, arsenic was used in all kinds of household products, from women's makeup to children's toys to dye for all sorts of fabric, and it was in low enough doses that at the time it was considered safe to touch. But that brand of wallpaper was the exception. Word soon spread across England about what happened to the Turner children. Dr. Orton's discovery sparked a national outrage, and concerned parents protested for the wallpaper to be banned. Dr. Orton campaigned for years until eventually the manufacturing of arsenic-based dyes was stopped. Thanks to Aunt Amelia, many children's lives were saved.